I'm going to discuss to you about Greek art. So let's begin with the origin of Greek art. The origin of Greek art is the Aegean art of classical antiquity dates back to Minoan culture of the 3rd millennium BCE, when the inhabitants of Crete, known as Minoans, after their king Manus, began to establish a thriving culture around 2100 BCE based on their successful maritime trading activities influenced by Assyrian art and other strands of Mesopotamian art. They built a series of palaces at Knossos, Festus, and Akrotiri, as well as the creation of a wide range of fresco painting, stone carvings, and ancient pottery, and other artifacts. During the 50th century, after a catastrophic earthquake which destroyed most of her palace, Crete was forced and overrun by warlike Mycenaean tribes from the Greek mainland. Mycenaean culture duly became the dominant force in the eastern Mediterranean. Then, not long after launching the Trojan War in 1194 to 1184, the city of Mycenae, along with its architecture and cultural possessions, was destroyed by a new set of marauders known as Dorians. At this point, most production of ancient art came to a standstill for about 400 years as the region descended into an era of warring kingdoms and chaos known as the Greek Dark Ages or the Geometric or Homeric Age. Next is the historical background. Ancient Greek art proper emerged during the 18th century. As things calmed down around the Aegean, about this time, iron was made into weapons, tools, people started using an alphabet. The first Olympic Games took place. A complex religion emerged, and a loose sense of cultural identity grew up. Around the idea of Hellas in Greece, by about 700 kingdom began to be replaced by oligarchies and city-states. However, early forms of Greek art were largely confined to a ceramic pottery, as the region suffered continued disruption from widespread famine, forced immigration. Many Greeks left the mainland to colonize towns in Asia Minor and Italy, and social unrest. This restricted the development of architecture and most other types of art, not until about 650, when maritime trade links were re-established between Greece and Egypt, as well as Anatolia, did Greek prosperity finally return and facilitate an upsurge of Greek culture. The third is the chronology of Greek art. The practices of fine art in Greece that evolves in three basic stages or periods, which was the Archaic period, the Classical period, and the Hellenistic period. The Archaic era was a period of a gradual experimentation. The Classical era then witnessed the flowering of mainland Greek, a power and artistic domination. The Hellenistic period, which opened with the death of Alexander the Great, witnessed the creation of Greek-style art throughout the region as more and more centuries, colonies of Greek culture were established in Greek-controlled lands. The period also saw the decline and fall of Greece and the rise of Rome. In fact, it begins with the complete Roman conquest of entire Mediterranean basin. Greek antiquity is sculpture, mural and panel paintings, mosaics, decorative art has been lost, leaving us almost entirely dependent upon copies by Roman artists and a few written accounts. Now we're going to know the creation of Greek style art. In pottery, architecture, sculpture, and the first Greek style art in Archaic period is the Archaic Greek pottery, the most developed art form of the pre-Archaic period. Was undoubtedly Greek pottery, often involving a large vases and other vessels. It was decorated originally with linear designs, a proto-geometric style, then more elaborated patterns of triangles, zigzags, and other similar shapes. Geometric pottery includes some of the finest Greek artworks, with vases typically made according to a strict system of proportions. From about 700, renewed contacts with Anatolia, the Black Sea Basin, and the Middle East lead to a noticeable Eastern influence, a Oriental style, which was mastered by Corinth ceramics. The new idiom featured a wider repertoire of motifs such as curvilinear designs as well as a host of composite creatures like sphinx, griffins, and chimeras. During the Archaic era itself, decoration became more and more figurative as more animals, zoomorphs, and then human figures themselves were included. This ceramic figure painting was the first sign of the enduring Greek fascination with the human body. As the noblest subject for a painter or sculptor, a fascination reclined in the high Renaissance painting of Michelangelo and others. Another ceramic style introduced by Corinth was black figure pottery. Figures were first drawn in black cerulean, then marked with incised detail. Additional touch were added in purple or white. Favorite themes for black figure imagery included the revels of Dionysus and the labors of Hercules. In time, Athens came to dominate black figure style pottery, with its perfection of a richer black pigment and a new orange-red pigment which led to red figured pottery, an idiom that flourished. Next is the Archaic Greek architecture. Greek architecture relied on a simple post and lintel building techniques. Arches weren't used until the Roman era. The typical rectangular building was surrounded by a line of columns on all four sides, or less, often at the front and rear only, like the example of Temple of Athena Nike. Roofs were constructed with timber beams overlaid with terracotta tiles. Pediments, like the triangular shape and each gable end, were decorated with relief sculpture or friezes, as was the row of lintels between the roof and the tops of the columns. Greek architects were the first to base their architectural design on the standard of proportionality. To do this, they introduced their classical orders. A classical orders is a set of design rules based on proportions between individual parts, such as the ratio between the width and the height of a column. There were three such orders in early Greek architecture: the Doric, Ionic, and the Corinthian. The Doric style was used in mainland Greece and later Greek settlements in Italy. The Ionic order was used in buildings along the west coast of Turkey and other Aegean islands. Greek architecture continued to be a highly influential on later styles, including Renaissance as well as neoclassical architecture and even American architecture of the 19th and 20th century. Next is archaic Greek sculpture. During this time, or this period, was still heavily influenced by Egyptian sculpture, as well as Syrian technique. Greek sculptures created stones, friezes, and reliefs, as well as statues in stones, terracotta, and bronze, and miniature works in ivory and bone. The early style of freestanding Daedalic sculpture, as exemplified by the works of Daedalus, Dionysus, and Skylis, was dominated by two human stereotypes: the standing nude youth, which name is Chorus, and the standing drop girl, named Chori. Of this, the male nudes were seen as more important. To begin with, both the Chorus and the Chori were sculptured in a rather rigid frontal Egyptian style with wide shoulders, narrow waist, arms hanging, fists clenched, both feet on the ground, and the fixed archaic smile. As time passed, the representation of these formulaic statues became less and rigid and more realistic. Later, more advanced archaic version of Kroi and Kurai included the Peplus Kuri. Next is the archaic Greek painting. Archaic Greek painting boasts very few painted panels. The only examples are the Petsa panels decorated in stucco colored with mineral pigments. Unfortunately, due to erosion, vandalism, and destructions, few original Greek painters have survived from this period. All that remains are a few painted slums of terracotta murals, the most prevalent art form to shed light on ancient Greek painting pottery, which at least gives us a rough idea of archaic aesthetic and techniques. However, the vases painting was seen as a low art form and is rarely referred to in classical literature. Second one is the classical period. The main contribution of Greek classicism to fine art was undoubtedly its sculpture, in particular the canon of proportions with realization of the idea human body, a concept which resonated so strong with high Renaissance 1,000 years later. The classical Greek pottery. During this era, ceramic and those vase painting experienced a progressive decline. Exactly why we don't know, but judging by the lack of innovations and the increasing sentimentality of the design, the genre appears to have worn itself out. The final creative development was the white ground technique, which had been introduced around 500. Unlike the black figured and red figured style, which relied on clay slips to create pictures, the white ground techniques employed paint and gliding on a white clay background, and is best illustrated by the funerary Lycethoi of the late 5th century. Classical Greek architecture. The high point of ancient Greek architecture was arguably the Acropolis, the flat top sacred hill on the outskirts of Athens. The first temples erected here during the Archaic period were destroyed by the Persians in 480, but when the city-state entered its golden age, its ruler Pericles appointed the sculptor Phedias to oversee the construction of a new complex. Most of the new buildings, like the Parthenon and Propylaea, were designed according to Doric proportions, though some included Ionic elements. In Temple of Athena Nike, the Erechtheium, the Archopolis was added to several times during the Hellenistic and Roman era. The Parthenon remains the supreme example of classical Greek religious art in its day. It would have been established with numerous wall paintings and sculptures, yet even relatively devoid of adornment. It stands as an unmistakable monument to Greek culture. The biggest temple on the Acropolis Hill, it was designed by Ectinus and Callicrates and dedicated to the goddess of Athena. Next is the classical Greek sculpture. During the era, as a whole, there was a huge improvement in the technical ability of Greek sculptures to depict the human body in a naturalistic rather than rigid posture. Anatomy became more accurate, and so a result, statues started to look much more true to life. Also, bronze became the main medium for freestanding works due to its ability to maintain its shapes, which permitted the sculpting of even more natural looking poses. Subjects were broadened to include the panoply of gods and goddesses, along with minor divinities, an extensive range of mythological narratives, and a diverse selection of athletes. Other specific developments include is the introduction of Platonic canon of proportions to create an idealized human figure, and the invention of contrapposto. During the late classical era, the first respectable sculpture is the female nudes appeared. Next is the classical Greek painting. A classical Greek painting is reveals graphs of linear perspective and naturalist representation which would remain unsurpassed until the Italian High Renaissance. And apart from vase painting, all this type of painting flourished during the classical period, according to authors like Pliny or Pausanias. The highest form was panel painting done in encaustic or tempera. Subjects included was the figurative common due to perishable nature of these panels along with centuries of looting and vandalism. Not a single Greek classical panel painting of any quality has survived, nor any Roman copy. And example of it is the fresco painting. Fresco painting was a common method of mural decoration in temples, buildings, houses, and tombs. But these larger artworks generally had a lower reputation than panel paintings. Hellenistic. The period of Hellenistic opens with the death of the Alexander the Great, and the incorporation of the Persian Empire into the Greek and world, Hellenistic had spread throughout the civilized world, and centuries of Greek arts and culture included cities like Alexandria, Anitoch, Pergamon, Miletus, as well as towns and other settlements in Asia Minor, Anatolia, Egypt, Italy, Crete, Cyprus, Rhodes, and the other islands of Aegean. Greek culture was thus utterly dominant, but the sudden demise of Alexander triggered a rapid decline of Greek imperial power. As his massive empire was divided between three of his generals, Antigonus I, who received Greece and Macedonia, Seleucus I, who took over controlled Anatolia in Mesopotamia and Persia, and the Ptolemy I, who ruled Egypt. The period is marked by massive Greek culture influence, but weakening Greek power, Greece and its empire would be ruled from ancient Rome. But even then, the Romans would continue to revere and emulate Greek art for centuries. Hellenistic architecture. The temple architecture, however, experienced a major slump from 300 BCE onwards. The Greek Peripteral temple lost much of its importance. Indeed, except for some activity in the western half of Asia Minor, temple construction came to a virtual stop during the 3rd century, both in mainland Greece and in the nearby Greek colonies. Even monuments projects like the Artemision at Sardis and the Temple of Apollo and Didma near Miletus made little progress. All this changed during the 2nd century when temple building experienced something of a revival due to partly to increase prosperity, partly to improvements made by the architect Homogeneous of Vernier to the Ionic style of architecture, and partly to the cultural propaganda war waged for increased influence between the various Hellenistic kingdoms and Bethlehem and Rome. In the process, temple architecture was revived, and an excessive number of Greek temples, as well as the small-scale structures and shrines, were erected in southern Asia Minor, Egypt, and North Africa. As far as styles went, the restrained Doric style of temple architecture fell completely out of fashion since Hellenism demanded the more flamboyant forms of the Ionic and Corinthian orders. Hellenistic sculpture. Hellenistic Greek sculpture continued the classical trend towards ever greater naturalism. Animals, as well as ordinary people of all ages, became acceptable subject for sculpture, which was frequently commissioned by wealthy individuals of families to decorate their homes and gardens. Sculptures no longer felt obligated to portray men and women as ideals of beauty. In fact, the idealized classical serenity of the 5th and 4th century gave way to greater emotionalism, an intense realism, and an almost Baroque-like dramatization of subject matter. Next is the Hellenistic painting, Hellenistic Greek painting, which was taught and propagated in a number of separate schools
both the mainland and the islands regarding subject matter. Classical favorites such as mythology, contemporary events were superseded by genre paintings, animal studies, still lifes, landscapes, and other similar subjects, largely in line with the decorative styles uncovered in Herculaneum and Pompeii, the first century and later, many of which are believed to be copies of Greek originals.